The winter of 1883 came down on the Dakota Territory like a hammer. It was not a gentle season of soft snows and cozy fires. It was a predator. The cold did not knock before it entered. It seeped through the chinking of the log cabins like a thief, stealing the warmth from hearths and the breath from sleeping children. The wind was not a song, but a shriek, a blade that sharpened itself on the vast, unforgiving flatness of the prairie. For the settlers in the small, hopeful cluster of cabins they called Providence, survival was a battle fought hour by hour, log by log. The problem was the cabins themselves. They were built from a script carried in the minds of men from Ohio, from Pennsylvania, from the forested hills of the East. They built tall, proud structures with high-peaked roofs meant to shed the snows of a different land. They laid foundations just deep enough to be respectable, and they chinked the gaps between the logs with mud and grass, a temporary peace treaty with the elements. But this was not the East. Here, the wind had no trees to break its stride. It hit the tall cabin walls and pried at them, testing every seam, every hopeful smear of mud. Inside these cabins, life was a constant losing war against the cold. Frost grew on the interior walls, delicate, deadly patterns of ice that mirrored the ferns of a warmer world. Families huddled close to iron stoves that glowed a menacing red, devouring cords of precious wood at an astonishing rate. A circle of warmth, perhaps 6 feet wide, was the entire world. Beyond it, the cold ruled. Water froze in buckets just steps from the fire. A man could feel a draft like a physical touch, a cold finger tracing his spine. The community struggled together, united in their misery. They shared what they could, offered a strong back to a neighbor whose woodpile was dwindling. But the fundamental flaw remained. Their homes, the very symbols of their conquest over the wilderness, were failing them. They were shelters in name only, thin-walled fortresses besieged by an enemy that never tired. They burned through wood faster than they could chop it, and the specter of a winter running longer than their fuel supply haunted every waking moment and chilled every dream. The first time the men of the settlement saw Elara Vance digging, they thought she was making a grave, or perhaps a root cellar. It was the only logical explanation for the deep, square hole she was methodically carving out of the prairie soil on her small plot of land at the edge of the settlement. Her husband, an engineer from the old country with a mind full of strange angles and theories, had succumbed to a fever the previous spring. Now she was alone with her 2 small children, Leo and Sophie, a quiet woman known more for her silence than for any particular skill. Elara was an outsider twice over. First by her marriage to a man they had considered an eccentric, a German who spoke of Roman heating systems and Russian stoves as if they were gospel. And now by her widowhood, a state that rendered her an object of pity and concern. The community expected her to rely on their charity, perhaps to move into a corner of someone else's drafty cabin for the winter. They did not expect to see her with a shovel in her hands, her face set with a grim determination that baffled them. Her idea was not born of inspiration, but of memory and desperation. She remembered her husband, Artur, spreading his diagrams across their small table, his finger tracing lines of airflow and heat convection. He had been obsessed with the concept of thermal mass. "They build with wood," he would say, his voice a low rumble of frustration. "Wood is a good wall, but it is a poor battery. It does not hold the heat. The cold comes, the fire dies, the warmth is gone. You must give the heat a place to live." He had drawn pictures of massive stone hearths, of flues that snaked through masonry benches, of homes built low to the ground, embracing the earth for insulation. The community saw her digging a hole. Elara saw a foundation. She was not building a cabin on the prairie. She was building it in the prairie. The idea that defied all local wisdom was simple. Go down before you go up. Use the earth itself as your first defense against the cold. And in the center of it all, she would build not a simple fireplace, but a heart of stone, a massive, solid core of rock and clay that would soak up the heat from a small, efficient fire and then breathe it back into the home, slowly, steadily, all through the long, frozen night. Silas Croft was the first to approach her. He was the most respected builder in Providence, a man whose hands had shaped half the cabins in the settlement. He stood at the edge of her excavation, his arms crossed, his face a mask of paternal disapproval. "Widow Vance," he began, his voice accustomed to being obeyed. "A root cellar is a fine thing for storing potatoes, but it is no place for children. You need a proper house. Let the men and I raise you a cabin before the first snow. A good, tall one." Ilara paused, leaning on her shovel. She looked at Silas, her eyes clear and steady. "Thank you, Silas, but I am building my house." He gestured at the hole with a sweep of his hand. This is a pit. You build up, into the sun. You don't bury yourself like a badger. The winter damp will get in. The snows will bury you entirely. It is foolishness." "The earth is warmer than the air," she said, her voice quiet but firm. It was a phrase Artur had repeated like a prayer. Silas let out a short, sharp laugh. It was not mean-spirited, but it was dismissive. The other men who had gathered nearby chuckled along with him. The sound was dry and rustled like dead leaves. "Warmer than the air in January?" he scoffed. "That's a cold comfort. This is a mistake, Ilara, a dangerous one." He turned and walked away, shaking his head. The other men followed, their quiet laughter drifting back to her on the wind. The verdict had been delivered. The widow's grief had unsettled her mind. She was building her own tomb. The mockery did not stop him, but it isolated her. The women of the settlement would visit, bringing small offerings of bread or salted meat, their eyes filled with a pity that stung more than any scorn. They would look at the deepening hole, at the piles of river stones she was painstakingly hauling with a small cart, and they would urge her to reconsider. They spoke of the cold, of the damp, of the darkness of living underground. They spoke of convention and safety. They saw a woman clinging to the strange, foreign ideas of her dead husband, a dangerous sentimentality. Ilara listened politely, thanked them for their kindness, and continued her work. She did not have the words or the desire to explain the principles of thermodynamics, the intricate dance of heat and mass that Artur had understood so well. Her husband had been a man of paper and ink, of theories and calculations. She had to become a woman of earth and stone, of muscle and sweat. The proof would not be in a diagram. It would be in the warmth on her children's faces come January. Her work became a rhythm that defined her days. Dawn broke, and she was in the pit, her shovel scraping against the hard-packed soil. The sun climbed, and she was at the river, wrestling smooth, heavy stones from the cold water, judging each one for its size and shape. The afternoon saw her mixing a mortar of clay, sand, and straw, her hands raw and caked with mud. She was building her home layer by layer, with a patience that the other settlers mistook for madness. The physical labor was immense. Every muscle in her body ached with a fire that was only banked by the exhaustion of sleep. She dug until her shoulders screamed in protest, then hauled stones until her legs trembled. There were days she felt she could not lift the shovel one more time, days when the pitying glances from her neighbors felt like stones themselves. But then she would look at her small, temporary shack and hear the dry, rasping cough of her son, Leo, a sound that promised a winter of sickness, and she would pick up the shovel again. In contrast to her slow, solitary progress, The rest of the community bustled with the familiar activity of winter preparations. Another family had arrived late in the season, and Silas Croft was leading a cabin raising. The air rang with the sound of axes, of men shouting, of hammers striking wood. They worked with speed and efficiency, erecting a traditional log structure in a matter of days. The walls went up, tall and straight. The roof was pitched high. They stuffed the gaps with the same mixture of mud and grass that had failed them all the winter before. They were repeating their mistakes with a confident energy. They celebrated the completion of the cabin with a small feast, the firelight casting their shadows long against the new wooden walls. From her pit, Ilara could hear their laughter, louder and more certain than the chuckles they had directed at her. They were doing what they knew. They were following the path of tradition, the one that felt safe and familiar, even if it led directly into the heart of a freezing winter. Her slow, silent work was a rebuke to their methods, an unspoken criticism they could not tolerate, and so they dismissed it as the folly of a grieving woman. She focused on the details, the small things that Artur had insisted were everything. The foundation was not just deep, it was lined with a layer of gravel for drainage and a thick barrier of packed straw and tarred canvas to stop the encroaching damp. The walls of her cabin rose only 4 feet above the ground, with the excavated earth bermed up against them, creating a gentle slope. The roof would be low-pitched, almost flat, designed not to shed the snow, but to hold it. "Snow is a blanket," Artur had told her, "a gift from the sky. Why would you throw away a blanket in winter?" The heart of the structure was the central stone column. It was not a fireplace in the conventional sense. It was a massive, rectangular pillar of masonry that rose from the floor to the ceiling. Inside it, a cleverly designed flue snaked back and forth, forcing the hot smoke from the small firebox to travel a long and winding path before it escaped through the narrow chimney pipe in the roof. Every inch of that path forced the smoke to surrender its heat to the surrounding stones. The pillar was her battery. It was designed to be charged with heat for a few hours in the morning, and then to release that heat for the rest of the day and night. Building it was the most difficult part. She had to lift heavy stones into place, fitting them together like pieces of a puzzle, mortaring every joint with a painstaking precision. Her children, too young to help with the heavy lifting, played nearby, gathering smaller stones or bringing her water. They watched their mother build their home with a quiet awe, their small world defined by the scent of wet clay and the steady scrape of her trowel. They did not understand the principles behind her work, but they understood her purpose. They felt the fierce, protective love that drove her every motion. By the time the first hard frost came, the other cabins were long finished, thin plumes of smoke rising from their chimneys in a constant stream. Ilara's home was just being roofed over. It looked less like a house and more like a mound of earth, a strange hillock on the flat prairie. The single door and 2 small windows seemed oddly placed, too low to the ground. Silas Croft made one last visit, his face grim. "The ground will freeze soon, Ilara," he warned. "You're out of time. This thing won't be ready." "It will be ready," she replied, not looking up from her work of fitting a window frame. He shook his head and left her to her folly. He had offered his help, his wisdom. He had done his duty as a neighbor. Now, whatever happened was on her own head. The settlement hunkered down for the winter, the men congratulating themselves on their preparations, confident that this year, with more wood chopped and stored than ever before, they would finally beat the cold. The great storm did not arrive like a guest. It arrived like an invading army. For a week, the sky had been a flat, metallic gray, the air holding a biting stillness, a deep cold that seemed to come from the ground itself. Then, one afternoon, the wind began to rise. It was not the usual prairie gale. This was a different beast, a low, guttural moan that grew steadily into a deafening roar. The sky turned a churning, bruised purple, and the first snowflakes began to fall. They were not fat, gentle flakes, but tiny, hard crystals, driven almost horizontally by the wind. Within an hour, the world outside the small windows of Providence vanished. There was no sky, no horizon, only a blinding, swirling vortex of white. The wind shrieked like a banshee, tearing at the cabins, rattling the doors, and forcing snow through impossibly small cracks. The temperature plummeted. It fell 10 degrees, then 20, then 30. The cold was no longer just a presence. It was a physical force, a malevolent entity that sought to break down their walls and consume everything within. Inside Silas Croft's cabin, which he had always considered the best built in the settlement, the situation was desperate. He and his 2 sons fed the pot-bellied stove relentlessly. The firebox roared, the iron sides glowing a dull cherry red, but its heat was a small, embattled island in an ocean of cold. The walls, once a source of pride, were now conduits for the Arctic air. The chinking had frozen solid and shrunk, opening up dozens of tiny fissures. Drafts cut through the room like invisible knives. His wife and daughter were huddled under a mountain of quilts, their faces pale, their breath pluming in the air. The cabin groaned and shuddered under the assault of the wind. A fine, powdery snow was being driven right through the walls, accumulating in small drifts along the floorboards. The woodpile, which had seemed immense just days before, was shrinking at a terrifying rate. Silas knew, with a certainty that chilled him more than the air, that they would not have enough to last if the storm kept up for more than another day. He looked at his family, at their shivering forms and frightened eyes, and the pride he had felt in his work curdled into a bitter, hollow fear. He had followed the rules. He had done everything the right way, and he was wrong. In Ilara's half-buried home, the storm was a distant rumor. The wind howled over the low roof, its fury passing harmlessly above them. The thick blanket of snow that quickly accumulated on the rooftop was not a burden, but another layer of insulation, silencing the outside world and locking in the warmth. Inside, there was a profound and gentle quiet. The air was still. There were no drafts. The great stone pillar in the center of the single room was warm to the touch, radiating a steady, even heat. Hours ago, Ilara had burned a small, slow fire in the firebox at its base for about 2 hours. Now, the fire was out, the iron door to the box cold. Yet the warmth persisted, flowing from the stone heart of the house. Leo and Sophie were asleep in their small beds, not huddled and shivering, but relaxed, their cheeks flushed with healthy warmth. The temperature in the room was not hot, but it was a comfortable, life-sustaining 60 degrees. Ilara sat at her small table, mending a tear in Leo's shirt, by the light of a single oil lamp. She could hear the faint, high-pitched scream of the wind far above them, but it was a sound from another world. Here, within her earthen walls, there was only peace. She had used less wood in the past day than Silas had likely burned in the past hour. She looked at the massive stone pillar, the physical manifestation of her husband's theories, and felt a wave of gratitude that was so deep it was almost painful. He had left them. But he had also left them this. He had left them a way to survive. The storm raged for 2 days and 2 nights without pause. For the people of Providence, it was a waking nightmare. Families abandoned their own cabins to huddle together in the larger ones, pooling their wood and their body heat in a desperate attempt to stay alive. The sounds of coughing echoed in the crowded, smoky rooms. Fear was a palpable thing, a cold guest who sat beside them at their meager fires. They were trapped, their world shrunk to the few feet of floor space around a dying stove. On the morning of the 3rd day, the wind finally began to subside. The silence that followed was almost as unnerving as the noise had been. Silas Croft knew he had to act. His own wood was nearly gone, and the communal pile in the center of the settlement was buried under an impassable drift of snow. He looked at his wife's face, etched with exhaustion and fear, and made a decision. He bundled himself in every layer of clothing he owned and stepped out into the frozen, alien landscape. He was going to check on the widow. It was a fool's errand, he thought. He expected to find a frozen mound, a tomb of snow and earth. It was his duty to at least try to dig them out. The journey was a brutal struggle. The snow was waist-deep, and in some places the drifts were taller than he was. The air was so cold it felt like breathing powdered glass. It took him nearly an hour to cross the 200 yards that separated his cabin from Ilara's. When he finally reached her plot of land, he stopped, his heart sinking. All he could see was a smooth, white dune where her home should have been. Only the very top of a narrow stovepipe poked through the surface of the snow. He had been right. She had buried herself. He began to dig frantically at the snow where he thought the door should be, his movements clumsy in his thick mittens. He was preparing himself for the grim discovery he was sure he would make. After several minutes of desperate work, his shovel struck wood. The door. He cleared the rest of the snow away, and, with a deep breath, he pushed it open and stumbled inside, bracing himself for a wave of deathly cold. The air that met him was not cold. It was calm and still and warm. It was a gentle, pervasive warmth that seemed to have no source, and yet was everywhere. He stood there, blinking, his eyes adjusting to the soft lamplight. The room was quiet. Ilara was sitting at her table, calmly grinding coffee beans. Her children were on the floor, playing with small wooden toys. They were not wearing coats or heavy woolens, just their simple daily clothes. They looked up at him, their faces curious, not gaunt and pale with cold. Silas stared, unable to comprehend what he was seeing. There was no roaring fire. The small iron door on the side of the massive stone pillar in the center of the room was closed and cool. He reached out a trembling, gloved hand and touched the stone of the pillar itself. It was warm, like a sun-baked rock in late summer. The warmth radiated from it in soft, invisible waves. He looked around the small, single room. There were no drafts, no frost on the walls. The air smelled of coffee and wood smoke and warm bread. Ilara rose from her chair. She did not look surprised to see him. She did not look triumphant. Her expression was one of simple, quiet compassion. "Silas," she said, her voice calm, "you look frozen. Come in. Let me get you some coffee." He could not speak. He just stood there, snow melting from his coat and pooling at his feet, the stark contrast between the howling misery he had just left and the impossible peace of this room overwhelming him. He had come here expecting to find a tragedy, a grim lesson in the price of foolishness. Instead, he had found a miracle. He had spent his life building houses, perfecting his craft, taking pride in his knowledge of wood and joinery. In that moment, he understood that he knew nothing at all. He finally found his voice, but it was a hoarse whisper. "How?" he asked, gesturing vaguely at the room, at the warm air, at the impossible reality of it all. "Your fire, it is out." "I burned it this morning, for a little while," Ilara explained simply, as if discussing the weather. "The stone holds the heat. It is enough." She poured hot water over the coffee grounds, and the rich aroma filled the small space. She handed him a steaming mug. His hands were shaking so much he could barely hold it. He took a sip. The warmth spread through him, but it was the warmth of the room that was truly thawing the ice in his soul. He looked from the sleeping children to the serene face of the woman he had openly mocked. He saw no judgment in her eyes, no hint of, I told you so. He saw only a quiet strength, a deep, unshakable certainty that came not from pride, but from knowledge. "My family," he said, his voice cracking. "Our wood is almost gone. We are so cold." The admission was the hardest thing he had ever had to say. It was a confession of failure, a complete surrender of his pride. Elara simply nodded. "Bring them here," she said. "There is room." Word spread through the battered settlement not by shouting, but by a slow, dawning realization. Silas returned to his cabin, his face transformed. He gathered his freezing family and, without a word of explanation to his bewildered neighbors, led them through the snow to Elara Vance's strange, half-buried home. Then another family, whose baby was sick with a lung-rattling cough, saw the procession and followed. They came to Elara's door expecting to find a crowded, desperate shelter. They found an oasis. They stepped from a world of brutal, biting cold into a haven of steady, gentle warmth. One by one, they entered the small cabin, their faces a mixture of disbelief and awe. The children stopped shivering. The baby's coughing eased in the warm, still air. They touched the warm stone of the central pillar, their expressions like those of pilgrims at a shrine. The laughter that had once echoed across the prairie at Elara's expense was replaced by a stunned, reverent silence. The storm finally broke, but its aftermath was a landscape of hardship. The settlers emerged from their homes into a world buried in white. Their cabins were damaged, their woodpiles depleted, their spirits low. But something fundamental had shifted. The old certainties had been shattered. The community's hierarchy of knowledge had been upended. The wisest among them was not the strongest man or the most experienced builder, but the quiet widow they had dismissed as a fool. A few days later, after the paths had been cleared and a semblance of order restored, Silas Croft returned to Elara's home. He did not come with his family this time. He came alone. He knocked on the low door, and when Elara opened it, he removed his hat, holding it in his hands like an offering. He did not step inside. He stood on her doorstep, a proud man made humble. "Elara," he said, his voice heavy with the weight of his new understanding. "I was wrong. I was arrogant, and I was a fool. What you have built here, it is the only thing that makes sense in this land." He looked past her, at the warm stone pillar that dominated the room. "My whole life I have worked with wood. I know how to join it, how to shape it. I thought I knew how to build a home. But I only know how to build a box. You have built a hearth." He met her eyes, and she saw in them a genuine and profound respect. The paternal condescension was gone, replaced by the earnestness of a student. "Teach me," he said. The words were simple, but they were the sound of a world changing. "Teach me how you did this, so that no family in this place ever has to be cold like that again." Elara did not hesitate. She invited him in, and this time he entered not as a skeptic, but as an apprentice. She unrolled the worn, precious diagrams her husband had drawn so many years ago. The paper was brittle, the ink faded, but the ideas they held were as powerful as the winter wind. She spread them on the table, and together they bent over the drawings of Roman hypocausts and Russian stoves. She explained the principles as Artur had explained them to her. She spoke of thermal mass, of how stone and earth could be made to store heat like a battery stores a charge. She explained how the snaking flue forced the fire to give up all its energy before the smoke escaped. She showed him how the low profile and earthen berms used the ground's own steady temperature to insulate the home from the vicious swings of the air. She explained how the blanket of snow was not an enemy to be shed, but an ally to be welcomed. Silas listened, his face rapt with concentration. He asked questions, not to challenge, but to understand. He traced the lines on the diagrams with a calloused finger, his builder's mind translating the abstract concepts into the practical reality of stone and mortar and wood. He saw the genius in it, a genius born of observation, of history, and of a deep respect for the power of nature, not a defiance of it. He spent hours in her warm, quiet home, absorbing the knowledge that had been offered so freely, without any hint of triumph or retribution from the woman he had so publicly doubted. That spring, the settlement of Providence was not rebuilt. It was reborn. The sound that filled the air was not the familiar ring of axes against tall timbers, but the rhythmic scrape of shovels against the rich prairie earth. Led by Silas Croft, the men of the community began to dig. They dug new foundations, deeper and wider than before. They did not mock the work. They embraced it with the fervor of converts. They hauled stone from the river, not just for foundations, but for the massive central hearths that would become the core of every new home. Silas, now Ilara's most dedicated student, directed the work, sharing the new knowledge with a convert's passion. He taught them how to build the winding flues, how to mix the clay mortar, how to fit the stones together to create a solid, heat-absorbing mass. Ilara would often walk among them, offering quiet advice, correcting an angle here, suggesting a different stone there. She was no longer the foolish widow. She was the wise woman, the architect of their survival. The very landscape of the settlement began to change. The tall, vulnerable cabins of the old way were dismantled, their logs reused in the new structures. In their place rose low, solid, earth-bermed homes that seemed to grow from the prairie itself rather than being imposed upon it. They were humble in appearance, lacking the proud height of their predecessors, but they possessed a strength and resilience that was far more profound. They were built for the reality of the Dakota winters, not for the memory of an eastern forest. The story of the winter of '83 and the widow's strange cabin spread across the territory. Travelers passing through Providence saw the new homes and were skeptical, just as Silas had been. But they would stay for a night, and they would feel the gentle, pervasive warmth that emanated from the stone hearts of the houses, and they would leave as believers. Surveyors and land agents took notes, sketching the design of what they began to call the Dakota Hearth, or the Winter Cabin. The idea, carried in letters and journals and travelers' tales, began to take root in other fledgling settlements across the plains. A quiet revolution in architecture was spreading, a revolution born not in a grand institute, but in the mind of a quiet German engineer, and brought to life by the hands of his determined widow. It was a legacy of warmth, a testament to the fact that survival in a harsh land depended not on brute force, but on cleverness, observation, and the humility to learn from the world around you. Years later, when Providence had grown into a proper town, with a church and a general store, the original earth-bermed cabins still stood, their low roofs covered in prairie grasses. They remained the warmest, most efficient homes in the region. Ilara Vance was an old woman then, her children grown with families of their own. She was no longer an outsider, but the respected matriarch of the community, a living legend whose quiet wisdom had saved them all. She never spoke of the winter of the Great Storm as a personal triumph. When asked, she would simply say, "My husband was a clever man, and the earth is a good blanket." Her legacy was not written in books of history, but in the foundations of the homes and the warmth on the faces of the children who grew up within them. It was a lesson etched in stone and soil, that the most powerful ideas are often the quietest, and true strength lies not in standing tall against the storm, but in knowing when to bend, when to dig deep, and when to trust in the slow, steady warmth of the earth. The story of her cabin, the one with no upper floor, became a parable for the generations that followed. It reminded them that the accepted way is not always the best way, and that progress often comes from the person no one is listening to. It was a powerful lesson in humility, a quiet testament to the enduring power of a new idea in the face of unthinking tradition. The cold still came to the Dakotas, as fierce and unforgiving as ever. But in one small corner of that vast land, the people were no longer afraid. They were ready. They had learned to give the heat a place to live. If this story reminded you of the power of quiet wisdom, share it with someone who believes in challenging the old ways. And follow for more inspirational stories of courage, survival, and ingenuity.